sense of what is happening globally. So, lots of our policies, if I look at them, I get the impression that they were not written in South Africa. They were written by South Africans, and somebody sat in South Africa and wrote them. But the policies look like cut and paste jobs from other countries. Just for example, we used to speak about, when I was younger, we used to speak about technical colleges, we had primary school, high school, university or tertiary education. Suddenly, in 1994, the language changed, and when we wrote the new policy, speak about higher education, further education and training, not adult education, what they call it, basic education. We never had those words before. Where were these words coming from? And when you went to look at documents from Britain in particular, but also from other countries, you saw that our language and their language was the same. So lots of what has been happening in education has been driven not locally, but globally. So we need to understand this phenomenon of globalization. I'm taking a particular view, as you will notice, and let me be upfront about this, in that I'm not a big fan. I think that there are advantages to globalization, but I think that we've underplayed the disadvantages of globalization. And so I'm going to be presenting the alternative case. Globalization as myth and menace, not just as miracle. So that's complete disclosure. Let me navigate between my stuff. So globalization and education, but let's first begin to discuss the notion of globalization by first looking at what is it that TVET promises us. People, if you need me to see you, you need to shout because I can't see you. Google stops me from seeing you, right? I can only see my screen. So TVET promises us two things. And I think that you should remember this because you can use this when you're arguing, because this is what you want TVET to do. The one thing that TVET promises us is that TVET promises us that if people do TVET, there will be economic development or there will be more productivity. The other word that they use it is economic competitivity. All right, so that we would be more competitive as a nation economically. That's the one promise of TVET. The other promise of TVET is that if people come to TVET, there will be social inclusion. Let me just admit somebody. All right. So if people come to TVET, there will be more social inclusion. Right? So come to TVET and you will find a job. That's the promise. And this is a very good promise to have because we can now hold people to this promise. Though we need to problematize this promise itself. Because we can say, is TVET doing this? So the question then is it true? Does TVET meet the kind of promises and expectations that are being made of TVET? And so this version of TVET, because there are many different, and we'll discuss this next week, there are many different versions of TVET. We only have one particular version of TVET. The globalized version of TVET, the one that is being sold to you, is a particular version of TVET. It is not the only possibility. And so the question is that, is this version of TVET that is being sold to us, is the miracle? Yahoo, everything's going to go right, etc. Is it a myth or is it a menace? Is this TVET good? Is it bad or is it ugly? So when it comes to globalization, This is one that I just took off YouTube. Somewhere down, I've got many more academic versions of globalization, because the whole notion of globalization is contested. So different people have different definitions of globalization. But this one that I took off YouTube seems to be quite close to one of the major theorists, which is TVET, where they argue that what globalization is, and you may have come across the concept before, is a process of interaction and integration amongst people, companies, governments, nations, and it is driven oftentimes by international trade, and it's supported by information technology. And what this process does, there's an effect on the environment, and there's an effect on culture, there's an effect on economic development, there's an effect on physical well-being in societies around the world. So that's kind of a broad definition. That's kind of a popular definition of globalization. And basically what globalization is, the people who are speaking about globalization, and some people are still debating whether it's a useful concept or not. But what they're saying is that time and space has been compressed. I can speak to you now, even though you're sitting in Limpopo, KZN, where else are people from? Mpumalanga, Cape Town, all of you sit in the same class. In fact, I can sit now and I can have a discussion with somebody in Thailand, right, as if they're sitting right next to me. Because information technology now makes that possible. Right? There's new information technology, there's new communication technology. Things are now different. Right? And this is changing. Also, there's been revolutions in shipping. Those container vessels that you had, people used to carry things around in little barrels, etc. Those container vessels have developed whole new logistics operations that make things like Amazon possible. I buy things now that come out of the USA and they're cheaper than they are in my own country. So there's all these changes that shipping and globalization makes. Right? And so there's more cooperation between governments, which we'll discuss. There's more cooperation between companies. There's more cooperation between people. We can sit in the same class as people in different countries. I can have conversations. I can collaborate on papers with people in other parts of the world. We can even belong to social groups. Most of my son's friends are not from here. They're not even in this country. They're Facebook friends, they're Reddit friends, they whatever nonsense, what else do these kids use? Right? But they've got friends from all over the world, and it's not just from their own little group that they would typically be with. Right? So they can be more cosmopolitan. And when these things happen, it affects us. So we're more connected as a world, basically. However, and I think that this YouTube video points this out, globalization's interaction is not an equal interaction. Not everybody in globalization is equal. So it's an unequal cooperation between governments. Some governments are more powerful than other governments. It's an unequal cooperation between trade. Some organizations are more powerful than other organizations. So there can be a measure of bullying. There can be a measure of winners and losers. And where this notion comes from, or our current version of globalization, because globalization is not new. We had trade running through Africa back in the time of Moses. Moses, for example, was married to a woman, to an African woman from Ethiopia, I think. All right. So there was those kind of international movements where lots of the shipping that went to Europe came from India via Punt, which is a point in Africa, and then it went through a little canal that they had and onto the Nile River, because it was easier than carrying it along the Silk Route, which was overland. It was easier to move things via ship, right? So Africa was the epicenter of lots of the trade that was happening during the time of the Bible, for example. Right. So it's not new. It's really old that people trade with each other. What's happening now, though, is that those trade relationships have been intensified. But part of what is happening now is that there's almost been a right-wing response where some people are saying, globalization is inevitable. It's just happening. And that's one group of people who are saying globalization is inevitable, it's just happening. There's another group of people who are saying that globalization is being steered by a particular group of people. And they are selling us this idea that we have no choice. And this idea, and this is the historical precedence of the idea, started mainly with a group called the Chicago School. People like Friedman, Hayek, Becker's human capital theory, which is very influential in ours. And they started to directly attack the idea of welfare capitalism under Keynes. What had happened is that after World War II, they had developed something called welfare capitalism because workers were starting to object. And there were more strikes, stronger labor unions, and what have you. And welfare capitalism said capitalism can look after you all, because there was this fight between capitalism and socialism. In Africa, we had what they call development theory, and we'll look at that later. And the response was to say, full employment capitalism, we will start producing health, we will start producing welfare, we will start producing all these things. And so free schooling, mass employment, almost total employment, health systems were free, etc. And people could go to the state and they'd get these things from the state. The Chicago School, which some people call neoliberalism, and there's different words for them. The Chicago School then said at a particular point, rich people can't afford this. We can't afford to be carrying everybody else. The poor must look after themselves. We need to look after the money. And if we make everybody rich, and they sold this in particular ways, right? They said that if the country becomes richer, then everybody becomes richer. That's basically the idea. Right. And so there were various things coming out of the Chicago School, and they first experimented with this in a place called Chile. And unfortunately, it was introduced, the notion of neoliberalism was introduced at the point of a gun, where they overthrew the elected socialist government. They overthrew that government. Some say it was supported by the CIA, and then they experimented with this new theory called monetarism in that area. So that's the Chicago School. But they were still small. But in the 1980s, Thatcherism, and in America, Reaganism started to develop. And what they did is there was almost a revolution where they started to should add more things. The first thing that they do, they needed to put down the labor movement. And they said the reason why we have an economic crisis right now, which was linked to the oil crisis in the 70s, they were saying the reason why we have an economic crisis right now is the workers. It's all the workers' fault. So we need to put the unions down. And that massive fights about the unions, they got rid of the unions, etc. And you'll see it again, those debates are starting to rise again in big companies like Amazon, and then where they're telling people, no, don't unionize. Right? So they put the workers' movement down. And then they started to say the state needs to pay for itself. Business cannot carry the state anymore. So cut taxes, let business get richer. And if business gets richer, there will be more jobs for everybody, etc. That's the route we're going to go. And we need to have a much tighter state. The state needs to be much more lean, much more mean. Right? It needs to become business centers. And so you had that Thatcherite kind of revolution happening, and this happened all over the world. So even your new Labour governments started to adopt new Thatcherite policies. And in its current form, probably around about the 1990s, what happened is that those shifts in policy were transported all over the world, including to South Africa. So either people were forced to adopt the policy, right, because the World Bank threatened them, and there are things called structural adjustment programs and that kind of stuff. So they're forced to adopt the policy, or people borrowed the policy by themselves, and we sent people overseas, and they came back with policies, and they said this is the way to do things. So there's a whole history around that, and I need to flesh that out. But that basically is the background, how we arrived at where we are today. And so driving this is in the wrong view. Sorry, this is in the wrong sequence. So there are two views of globalization. The one view, the one is those people are trying to sell globalization to you. And then there's another group who are telling you, those who are telling you not to buy it. Don't buy this particular version of globalization. And so people like myself, and you don't have to agree with me. I think that I want to see that you have a balanced account. Right? I'm just giving you an alternative view because the media is feeding you one view. So I'm just feeding you part of an alternative view. But people like myself would argue that globalization is happening whether we like it or not, but we have to understand where we are being fooled and where we are being told to consent to certain things. And we have to develop an understanding of how we then begin to challenge some of the things that we are being sold as gospel. So some of the ways in which this is now happening is that there's a whole lot of international groups. There's one missing here. There's a whole lot of international groups, international bodies that have an influence on what we do in our country and what we do in our colleges. So, for example, there's the United Nations, which is a political group. And so through the United Nations, people sign accords with UNESCO. People sign that they're going to be part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and they tell all of you must get on board with the Sustainable Development Goals. There's the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization, were the people behind closing the whole world down with COVID. So they have a certain amount of power, but again, that power is unequal. Some people rule the UN as opposed to other people. They can decide what the UN decides, what the UN doesn't decide. In fact, certain governments have veto powers within the United Nations. So it's whose voice gets heard within these. Which voices are foregrounded, which voices are backgrounded. Then there are other bodies which are less official. For example, lots of the documents on TVET will come from an organization called the OECD. I think it stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The interesting thing about the OECD is for rich countries only. And currently, the OECD, though it's an influential and they portray themselves as an international organization, they're not international. Africa's not there, and I think there's only one Latin American country there. So the third world is largely absent from the OECD. Another group of people that is hugely influential, probably more influential than the United Nations, are your finance people. And these bodies are attached, by the way, to the United Nations. And they are almost a shadow government in the United Nations. There's the World Trade Organization, which says how trade should happen. And let me give you a sneak preview of a later slide. What the World Trade Organization is saying, that we need to free trade, we need to liberalize trade, everybody must trade. But the rules are almost anti-third world in terms of how they're being done. And so Africa has been stuck in selling raw materials. And they are saying, no, Africa can't put up barriers. We can't fix the prices, etc. We must allow people to go to Africa and set the prices. So they will go to different African governments and to different Latin American governments, and people will negotiate. Your big bodies, your big multinational corporations, who is not on this list, but they are very key. The big multinational corporations, they then can begin to drive the prices down by creating competition between different African organizations. And we have been stuck in Africa, and I suspect in Latin America as well. We've been stuck in selling raw materials. So we don't produce the cell phones that use our platinum. We produce the platinum. So we produce the platinum, we send them to Hong Kong, we send them to the USA, we send them to, where else do they make platinum? China even. Oh, sorry, Hong Kong is in China now. And they produce the cell phones and they sell it back to us. So we're buying our own stuff. And there's lots of that raw materials. We package, we send, in terms of the food revolution, we produce lots of the food, but we send it overseas. They package it and they sell it back to us. Coffee is produced. Africa is the major producers of coffee. So we produce, instead of producing stuff for sustained development of ourselves, we produce things for export. So we're selling it. I forget the phrase now, but it's something from sustenance to commodities. I'll get to the phrases now. But we produce for export. So remember that time, you guys went around then. In Somalia, there was a time when people were dying on the side of the road from starvation. During that same period, Somalia was exporting grain to other countries. People could not afford to buy the grain that they themselves were selling. And the grain was going overseas. It was being packaged by multinational corporations like Kellogg and being sold back to us. And the people who made the money were not the third world countries. It was the shipping companies. The World Bank. So I'm giving you all Skinner background information. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, when we had, and Patrick Bond writes about this, he documents this whole process. When we had our first democratic revolution, representatives from the World Bank came and they met with the ANC to discuss our policy. Not us, them. And they came up with a whole range of policies between us and the World Bank. Who's the World Bank to tell us what to do? They are the World Bank. Why did we listen to them? Because international rating agencies will tell you that this is the value of your currency. We don't decide whether the rand is strong or weak. Somebody else does. People like the World Bank, people like the International Monetary Fund. They decide what our credit rating is. So, before every ANC conference, you will see that the international rating agencies will downgrade our currency. They say because you're not sure what the government is going to do, and they don't just do it to us, they do it to governments all over the world. And they will downgrade our currency because they are scared that we will have policies which is not in line with the World Bank thinking. So if we disobey, if we disobedient children, out comes the whip. And the whip is economic. The whip is economic. So the World Bank was here and they told us these are the policies you're going to have or else. Basically, that's what Patrick Bond argues. The IMF was down here, the International Monetary Fund, and they lent us, I think, 7 billion rand. So the first thing is that they forced us to pay off the 148 billion rand that the apartheid government owed. The new democratic government had to pay off back that 148 billion rand that the apartheid had to oppress the people who are now in power. The second thing is then they gave us 7 billion rand to pay off that 140 billion rand that we owed. And attached, and here's the point, attached to that 7 billion rand were secret conditions. This was even before the new government had been elected. before the new government had elected, the IMF had secret conditions with the government in waiting. We weren't allowed to be told by our own government what conditions they had made. So there's some very strange things happening, particularly in finance. When there were land invasions in Zimbabwe, overnight, the economy tanked. So there are very powerful forces acting on us, which are not internal to us ourselves. There's another group of people. There's the World Economic Forum, for example. Have you heard of this idea of the Fourth Industrial Revolution? It's all over the show. The Fourth Industrial Revolution was coined, the term Fourth Industrial Revolution. Now, we're not saying it doesn't exist, but the term was coined by Klaus Schwab, who was the CEO of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He wrote the book on it literally. Right? There's an actual book by Klaus Schwab called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And this is a kind of a billionaires club where the billionaires all get together with the governments of the world, and they have what they call a think tank. And they say, this is the new idea. And so from the World Economic Forum, they don't belong to anybody. They're not accountable to anybody. But they told everybody the Fourth Industrial Revolution is what we're going to go. And you guys have probably, maybe all of you, maybe some of you have attended workshops about how do we get on board with the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I'm not saying it's not happening, but I'm saying that these ideas come from somewhere. So I'm not one of those people who believe that globalization is neutral or value-free. It is happening, but the way in which it's been happening is unequal and it's being steered by certain people because they have the power to do so. Just on this score, for example, did you know that the third richest country in the world is a company called BlackRock? So after the USA and China, the third richest country in the world is a company, according to somebody on the internet anyway. And this company is international, and they have people advising governments in most countries in the world. There are people, if I understand correctly, there were a few years ago, there were people who were in the United States of America in the Treasury Department who belong to this company. So there's a revolving door between these companies and what happens. Right? So your multinational corporations, none of you are from East Cape Midlands, eh? I can't remember if there's anybody from East Cape. I think I may have seen somebody from East Cape Midlands. Utenake. If the Volkswagen is the Volkswagen, are you from who's that? I know that I saw somebody from East Cape Midlands. Peggy. What's the big company? There's a big motor company there.
Yes, is it Volkswagen? Yes, it's the Volkswagen.
Like, Volkswagen closed down. If Volkswagen leaves, then Utenake is basically a ghost town.
Yes.
So Volkswagen can call the shots because the person is the golden rule. The person who has the gold makes the rules. Volkswagen calls the shot in Utenake. They can decide whatever they want to. Amazon, the big billionaires company, Amazon doesn't pay taxes because they said we will open up a place in we will open up our head offices in your city, and this is in the USA, right? One of the most powerful countries in the world. In fact, the most powerful country in the world. They will tell a city, we want to open up a company. And they don't go to the city to ask, will you have us there? The city has to apply to them and say, please, please, please come to us. So they don't apply to the city applies to them. And they have tax havens. The cities, they don't pay taxes. Google doesn't pay taxes. Amazon doesn't pay taxes. There are a number of companies who don't pay taxes because they're simply so rich. So these multinational companies that traverse the whole world have a huge impact because they control the money. Most a large part of our electricity is being used by the platinum mines. Not by the platinum mines, but the platinum people who dissolve platinum and manufacture platinum. I think it's out there by you people in the KZN. They're platinum plants. And platinum drives the world economy because platinum is the basis for these cell phone touchscreens and stuff. So everybody in the world needs platinum. We produce it. And you know what happens with the platinum countries? They pay a fraction of the electricity cost that all of us do. They get subsidized electricity, subsidized by Eskom, subsidized by us. I'm not even sure if that platinum company is a South African company. They call the shots. They have decided how much electricity. And platinum, by the way, uses huge amounts of electricity. Huge amounts of electricity. So there's these international things. These are things that are happening behind the scene that we have to adhere to. So and then of course there's these media houses. Because the media houses, again, they don't control the word. You'll see that the same stories that are being carried in the UK are the same stories that have been carried here because there are international press associations who decide which version of the truth you hear. So, for example, the Ukraine crisis, there are two versions of that truth. Actually, there's at least two. There's the American side, there's the Russian side, and there's the truth. Right? So there's three versions. But the Russian side of the debate is absent. You can't hear it at all. Right? The whole notion of NATO encroachment onto their territory, how it's been a 20-year struggle to not have that NATO encroachment, the whole way in which the USA is supporting that particular struggle, even though that struggle can end tomorrow. None of that is heard. I'm not saying that I'm a pro-Putin fan, but I'm saying that the USA is completely not innocent in this matter. But they are helping to let those people die because the Ukrainians are fighting their battle on their behalf. It's what they call a proxy. In the Cold War, we used to call it a proxy war. They're using the Ukrainians to fight what's effectively an American battle. Because America oftentimes is driving this, but now they're talking about the multipolar world. Right? So China and Russia have made inroads where they begin to challenge America's dominance, and America is going to try to get rid of Russia first. And once they've got rid of Russia, then they can begin to surround China. So they need to address these things. So this is global politics, but it's being played out, and a certain version of it is being sold to you. The media, by the way, is also selling you other stuff. It's telling you to say that what's the most important to you in your life is that you buy. The stuff about social justice and all the stuff, the poor, etc., that's not important. Buy. Look at the Kardashians. Don't you want that glamorous lifestyle? Don't you want that? Don't you want to buy this product? So it promotes a particular version of what our reality should look like. So they're not selling it directly, and they're telling you, but there are ways in which messages are being crafted, and in which consent is being manufactured through the media houses. So there's lots of bodies and groups that drive this whole globalization process. There are advantages to globalization. Right? But the story that you're being sold is not the only story that there is to globalization.
So say what you're essentially saying is that most of these media houses are in the payroll of all these big businesses and big financial backings, and to sell us a false narrative.
Basically. Thank you. You're much better put than I have. Who is that? That's basic. Because the poor don't own any media houses. They can't. You need money to run a media house. But, and this is part of the advantages, how then do we, what role then, by the way, should TVET colleges be playing? So when we're teaching media houses and when we're teaching IT, etc., IT can produce knowledge, can produce new knowledges and disseminate them for free. So this information technology, which was used to communicate between businesses, this information technology can be used by other people if we reconfigure TVET in particular ways and empower and enable our own people to do things differently, to speak their own truths, to tell alternative narratives. I don't know, by the way, how to deal with the financial crisis. But maybe next week we'll look at what the development theories are that's around there. All right, so there's a whole lot of stuff. Please do.
And then how do we know?
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm Mzwandile Ngwenya.
I'm Zandri.
Hello, sir. I just wanna know quickly, and how do you then separate the truth or the real truth from the false truth?
Truth is, that I wouldn't know, actually. The only way, I think Malcolm X suggests, he says that you need to see for yourself, think for yourself, act for yourself. You need to listen for yourself, see for yourself, think for yourself. So the only way that we can do that is if we begin to do our own independent research and we start reading alternative materials. And we're hoping that people can begin to share that. Unfortunately, the alternative materials are hidden away. I look for some stuff now. I was looking for them on YouTube, some of the more critical narratives. I can't find them because the YouTube algorithm only points me towards the good news stuff. So I can only find, positive issues of globalization. I can't find the other stuff. It's just not there. It hasn't been uploaded, or the algorithm shifts me away from that. I was looking for a YouTube video which was critical of the Ukrainian crisis. It's gone. It's missing. I don't know where it is. Right? But I know that I look for it, so I don't know why the algorithm is pointing me towards the pro US versions of of the Ukrainian crisis, for example. So I don't know how. I don't have an answer for you, Mzwandile. I wish I did. In fact, I'm only starting to look at this issue now myself. So this is a bit half-baked, to be quite honest. This requires much more research than I currently have done. So this is probably in the next month or two, I'm going to be trying to read with my colleagues around these kind of issues, because I think there's almost a shadow government that's happening, both in terms of finance, in terms of media, that we're not quite looking at. So like I said, there were two gurus, those who are telling you to sell, those who are not buying it. And driving this whole thing are a number of different things. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but here's some of the stuff that are driving. One is your multinational corporations, because they needed to develop ICT and data and that kind of stuff, and they developed it. The internet was developed by he's also Timothy, Tim Berners-Lee, I think. And the reason why he did it, because he needed to communicate with other people. He, by the way, gave it away for free. But nowadays, all your multinational corporations, your Googles, your Microsofts, your Amazon, your Tesla, mainly started on ICT, your information communication technologies, etc. So there's them, but there's also other multinational corporations, your big shipping companies, etc. They have an enormous amount of influence in government. They don't even have to tell government what to do. They say that if you don't do it, government always has to think about how your multinational corporations will respond. They will say, we can't do this because people will disinvest. Right. There are certain things that Africa cannot do because people will simply threaten to pull their money out of the company. They will pull Volkswagen out because our government is turning out, and Uteneg is gone. Uteneg becomes a ghost town. The other thing that has been driving this globalization, all of us coming closer together, because in multinational corporations, we're now working with people working across different countries. So people are flying back and forth like never before. People are internet, we are in webinars, we're doing all kinds of stuff. So the multinational corporations mean that people are also working across borders. The other thing that's happening is that people are now working, there's new technology revolutions that enable us to do stuff. In the fourth, just as a sideline, with the fourth industrial revolution, as they're calling it, there are new technology stuff. So ICT was the third technology. The information technology was the third technological revolution. The fourth technological revolution, suddenly new things are happening. All right, and that's what Klaus Schwab then begins to speak about. Just for example, it is conceivable that because if 5G means that I can operate at the same space at the same time as a machine will somewhere else, the machine can in fact respond quicker than I do. A doctor can use an electronic arm. A doctor sitting in Canada can use an electronic arm and operate in somebody in Australia by using that electronic arm. So those kind of things are theoretically possible. So the technology is developing, and technology has been developing all the time from the dawn of the 1980s, the 1880s. People start to say technology revolutionizes itself all the time. It's not new. The other thing that is driving this is international finance and trade, and they have a huge influence. We used to be manufacturing economies. I don't have the figures with me right now, but if one were to track it over the last couple of years, I just had a casual glance at it, you'll see that the manufacturing trade that that I grew up with, where everybody was in manufacturing, that is shifting. And people are now moving into finance jobs and into services sector. And so those are the new jobs. So people are now baristas, and they are travel agents, and they sit in, they're organizing your flights and all those people, service stuff. People actually making things are not necessarily your big earners. It's all about slushes, money flowing around. Right now, flowing right through your living room are billions of dollars. You can't grab them, but they're flowing around in ones and noughts. Because previously you need to send money and you need to send gold across. Now you can just send digital stuff around. There's more money in the world now that if you had to have $100 bills, it would be literally the size of Everest. There's lots and lots of money flowing around. None of it is coming into my pocket, unfortunately, but there's lots and lots of it flowing around. One of the things that affects us, and maybe the last three things affects us in the third world more than it does the first world, is that, in fact, it affects the first world as well. But there's an international division of labor. So instead of labor just being inside of your country, now labor is internationally divided. So we manufacture cars in Uitenhage. Peggy, you guys are coming up a lot, eh? You guys are manufacturing cars in Uitenhage. You're manufacturing Mercedes-Benzes in Buffalo City. You're manufacturing Volkswagens, but you're not designing them there. Somebody else is designing them. Right? So we put the stuff together, then we send it off somewhere else, and they sell it back to us. But we don't own those companies. We simply work for them. And this gives the companies in the richer countries a lot of power over their own workers in those countries, and they're complaining about it in those countries. It's part of the reason why people like Trump and them came to power, is because now instead of having the companies in America don't have to employ Americans anymore. They can outsource it. So if you're dealing with a trade office and somebody you need to get advice, you get the advice from India, and you make a phone call through to India, and the Indian tells you what's happening in America in the corner store around you. We are manufacturing the Volkswagens, but Volkswagen is a German company. They don't manufacture it there. So there's an international division of labor, and this international division of labor is not equal. Sometimes, especially, and they point this out, these multinational companies run around the world looking for cheap labor, looking for countries that are prepared to drive the workers' wages down. So if we can provide cheap labor, then we invite them over to take advantage of our labor, and somebody else gets a kickback. Right? So somebody benefits here in the country, but the more you exploit your labor, the better. So there's this international division of labor which affects particularly your third world in terms of what kinds of jobs are coming to us. Similarly, there's the international governance structures, as who are they governing? So there are rules and terms of regulations that are being made, and for a long time they were what they call, when they borrowed money to Africa, I'm not sure about Latin America, but I know in Africa quite strongly, they had what they call structural adjustment programs. They said, we will give you this money, but here are the conditions. You will run your government in this way if we give you this money. And Julius Nyerere had choice words to say to them when they came about that, but they forced him to do so. Ironically, the other area that drives is international aid, because international aid can be used to drive and make decisions. When people give you money, they say, we will give you money if you do it this way. And I'm being nasty because, I mean, I'm sure I've been a beneficiary of some of these international aid organizations. But we need to think around how we use international aid. My wife started a shelter for abused women, and every year they would, lots of them work for free and what have you, so that's another story. Very proud of her. But every year they would change the goalposts and say, you must do this, you must do that, you must do that. And after a while we said, no, these people are not going to tell us what it is that we must do. Right? But international aid has shaped to a large extent what happens in countries outside of, let's say, the West, outside of the first world. So it's something that we need to think about how we use it. I mean, it's useful. I'm not saying don't take the money. But we need to think about how international aid begins to shape the decisions that we are allowed to make. And ironically, international aid has oftentimes, in some ways, made countries more dependent rather than less dependent. But all of these things, like I say, is a debate. There's an article written on international aid by Simon McGraw. I think I'll include it in next week's pack, for those of you who are interested. He's writing out of South Africa. But there's all of the stuff that makes this possible. So it's not in our imagination. Globalization is happening, and there are structures, there are bodies, there are financial flows, there are factories that make it not only possible, but makes it almost inescapable, that we can't get out of it. And we need to think very carefully before we make decisions that go against this, because we will be disciplined. I left the military off there. There's also global military stuff. However, there have been disadvantages to the same. I'm going to give us a break now. One is that unemployment has kind of mushroomed in different areas of the world. There's been huge unemployment, and people are saying, unemployment as if it fell out of the sky. Unemployment didn't fall out of the sky. Unemployment was definitely was in some ways manufactured. And in your West, especially, they are now worried because their unemployment, and it's nowhere near our unemployment, but what's happening is that in the West, they are exporting jobs to where the workers are cheaper. So people in America, in Britain, etc., are losing jobs to people from other countries. Or people from other countries are being brain drained out of this country and taken elsewhere. So as soon as just for example, I'm trying to think of what's this guy, first African in space. So before these other millionaires went to space, South Africa put one in space. What is his name? Mark
Shuttleworth.
Mark Shuttleworth, that's the one. So Mark Shuttleworth developed something. This is on a different point. But Mark Shuttleworth develops groundbreaking technology. I think that he created the basis for blockchain. But South Africa doesn't benefit. It's not that I'm a big fan of Mark Shuttleworth and what he tried to do. But what happened is that international companies then come and they buy it off you. So whilst we develop the technology here, the technology now belongs to another country. My father was an Anglican priest, so I tend to use biblical examples quite a bit. Sorry for those of you who don't belong to my religion. There was a time when Esau had come back. It was one of Abraham, one of their children in that old Abraham line. And his brother Jacob was waiting for him with a pot of lentils, and he sold him for the pot of lentils. He says, I want your birthright. And so we sell our birthright. So our brightest and best get taken out of the country and move somewhere else. But that's a different point. So their brain drains, their technology drains, etc. So once something is developed here, we almost have to sell our birthright to other people because they come along and they claim that. We train our medical doctors for free. I mean, we heavily sponsor this country, heavily sponsors medical doctors, because we want to have medical doctors to look after our people. Our medical doctors, once they got the money, boom, gone. And we do lots of sponsoring of training. So we train them, but then other countries benefit. So there's not a thing mentioned here, but brain drain is one of the issues. But unemployment, particularly for your northern countries, ecological disaster. The trade is happening so quickly, there's more and more ecological disaster. And also because these MNCs, these multinational companies are benefiting from labor exploitation, people are now, and you know that the big one of this is what's this company, Nike, is very famous for this. You know, where they send the jobs and they have child labor doing the stuff, etc. And they just say, look, we didn't know, look, we didn't know. Ecological disaster, there's all these big oil spills, etc. And here again, there's one deal, the media houses came in big way, your advertising agencies. And the advertising agencies are brilliant. So when plastics were a problem, so they invented the whole notion of, not recycling, there's another word, but basically recycling plastic. So the whole notion of recycling plastic came about when people discovered that plastics are dangerous. So the media houses told them, not the media houses, the advertising companies or PR companies, etc., told them, don't try to fight this. Don't try to deny it. Lean into it. Tell everybody that you care and say, you know what? Yes, plastics are dangerous. You can do something about it. You must recycle your plastics. Not us. We don't have to start to produce less plastics or produce plastics that are less dangerous. You can do this. And so they put the responsibility on us to solve their mess. When there was an oil spill crisis, then again they had this huge brainwave. The media companies have said, let's create this thing called carbon credits, and let's look at our carbon footprint. So ironically, the whole notion of a carbon footprint was invented by a media house or a advertising agency, a PR agency for the oil company to divert attention away from what the oil companies were doing. So the oil company says, sure, this was bad, but you guys can do something to help us eliminate our carbon footprint. And this is what we've done to eliminate our carbon footprint. So they've actually turned a negative into a positive. And they made us believe this by inventing this carbon footprint. And now everybody's speaking about minimizing your carbon footprint, etc. It was a trick. It was a joke. And they've even written it into the policy where companies have to sell, where countries have to count their carbon footprint. What's this? They get carbon credits. So you can sell your carbon credits. Africa can sell its carbon credits to Britain and say, Britain, you're polluting, but we're not polluting, so we will sell our carbon credits to you. As a result, Britain can pollute and their economy can develop, but we sold our carbon credits, so we can't develop polluting industries so that we can develop that way as well. So there are all kinds of media stuff around the ecological disaster. And the last thing is that there's instability in domestic markets. I suspect that we are due for another recession. Because when something goes wrong in the USA, like it did in 2009, so if the USA catches a cold, everybody has to sneeze because all the markets are interconnected. If something happens in China and there's a COVID breakdown in China, everybody gets sick because there's interconnection of travel and markets. That's globalization. Everyone is connected, both the good and the bad and the ugly. Unfortunately, the good, the ugly, and the bad is more interconnected, it seems, than the good. So we need to change that narrative. And in Africa, there's been a particular version or particular effects of globalization. One is that there's been unfair trade. We trade in raw materials. We're not allowed to erect price barriers which will protect our economy. So here in the Western Cape, for example, the clothing industry has collapsed because the companies here, the companies are still South African, but somebody in China is making our garments for cheaper. Right. So we're exporting the raw materials, or we're doing the designs, but somebody else they are making stuff. So people have lost jobs. Right. But there are ways in which trade is not necessarily fair. That means that there are more centers, means that not everything is coming out of America. There are now Indian billionaires, there are Chinese billionaires, there are Russian billionaires, there are African billionaires. Right? So it's more spread out, but still the terms of trade are not equal. The other thing is that in Africa has been the International Division of Labor. We get the crappy jobs, right? The cheap labor stuff, working in the mines, blowing yourself up, that kind of stuff, that comes to Africa. The good jobs, not as much. Also, there's brain drains, and so there's all kinds of ways in which the International Division of Labor affects Africa, the way in which globalization happens. A third thing which has characterized Africa's experience of the globalization has been the debt crisis. We have been unable as a continent to get out of debt. And because we are in such debt, we owe other countries stuff, so they get to tell us what to do. And that has, in many ways, led to increasing repression within African countries so that people can pay their debt. And also because there are greedy elites within Africa who are on the payroll of international forces. And then the last word, and this is a very old word, but for some reason they took it out, and we're not calling it imperialism anymore. We're now calling it, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or we're calling it globalization. So people are giving ugly things nice new names. But what imperialism had done oftentimes in our country, and this is what we speak about in the 80s, is that when they invested in our country, people say, no, we must get investment in, etc. And yes, they must. But the point of investment is that the more money you put in, the more money you take out. So Volkswagen is giving people jobs, but they're taking out more money than they put in, else they're not a business. So we're not producing those cars, they're producing the cars, we're manufacturing, they're sending them back to us. By the way, you can get a car cheaper in Namibia than you can in South Africa, even though we built it here in South Africa. But they're taking out much more money. So people are leaving. There are masses and masses and masses of money leaving this country. So we exporting cheap stuff and we're buying the expensive stuff. We're producing the labor, and it's going out as super profit. So Africa, in many ways, but not all Africans, some people have benefited from this thing hugely, and those are often the people in power. But generally, Africa has come at the short end of the stick when it comes to globalization, in my view. Like I say, I need to do more research, but that's basically the idea. So anyway, I'll send it to you. These are some of the definitions. There are different definitions. All right. So that's my take on things. I think that we should take a break unless people.
Yeah, we can. But just before we take a break, I just want to ask, because it looks, yes, sir. It's you made comparisons between the first world and the third world, and what you were saying, it looks to me as though we as Africans are forced to remain as a third world country or a third world nation or continent, so to speak. So meaning that we can never get out of it. We will remain like this, like until I don't know, maybe I heard you incorrectly.
That seems to be the case, unless we think differently. Now, on this, and I know you asked me for the answers on the, unfortunately, we don't have the answer right yet. Because if you look at some of the, even in TVET, our literature, our African literature, because I've been criticized for this previously on the course, but our African literature is more European than the European literature. It's brainwashed, and in some cases just brain dead. We are echoing back to Europe what we heard from it, as if they are nearer, my God, to thee.
Oh, okay.
In Africa, I think that we need to start doing our own research and start saying, how do we do things differently? How does this economic connection, how does it work exactly? Because if we know how it works, then we can start developing an antidote. What did we develop for Corona? What did they call this again? Not an antidote. What's the medicine that they gave us again?
A vaccine.
Pfizer, what? Pfizer.
Pfizer, and what was Pfizer called again? It was not an antidote.
A vaccine.
A vaccine. How do we vaccinate ourselves against what is happening? But we need to understand first what is happening to us. And in order for us to do that, we need a new form of scholarship. One that is African in character, not just African in name. We shouldn't just, and I think Fanon had warned us about, we knew this in the 1970s, like we've got mass amnesia. Like we forgot how to do these things which we knew how to do. We were the leading thinkers in the planet, came from here. Right? Not from South Africa, from Africa. Paulo Freire went from a conference in Africa, I think it was organized in Ghana, and he threw away what he did, and he came out of that conference and he went to go write Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Because he was influenced by African thought. The whole notion of non-racialism, that there is no such thing as race, started here in Cape Town. We have had some of the leading people like Malcolm X, etc., that we quote nowadays, got his ideas from here, not us from him. Now we're quoting him. But Africa needs to rediscover itself and say, and I think I'm going to throw in a bit of a non into the next lesson, to say that we need to think our old concepts, we need to think them anew. We need to rethink them. At the moment, I myself am drawing on some of the literature that is coming out of the UK, especially out of Britain, ironically enough. The British literature is more Africa-friendly than the African literature. So we need to rethink how we think. We need to look at the stuff that is being told us, that is being sold to us as truth, and need to say, is this really true? Let us go check and find out for ourselves what is happening. Remember at one stage, Timbuktu was, and Egypt, Africa was the leading thought center in the world back in the old world. In the time of Socrates, etc., Socrates studied in Egypt, which is a city in Africa. Before the Arabs came across, Egypt was an African city. Right? Punt, which is like left out of the story, the open equation, that has been erased from our memory. But that was the trade center of the world during the time of Moses. So Africa was the leading trade center. At the time of the 1400s, Timbuktu was the major library in the world. They wouldn't even allow Europeans in because the Europeans were too savage. So there was a time when Africa was the thought center of the world, and then we got destroyed because we didn't have guns. Right? So they Alexander the Great destroyed our library in Egypt. They came and they basically destroyed all our books and all our knowledge here in Africa with the guns, and they erased from the map everything that Africa knew. And they've sold us the idea that Africans are stupid. We need to rediscover the stuff it is that we knew. We need to rediscover the things that we discovered even during the 1980s, during the 1970s when we were colonized. Because we were colonized, we could see the nonsense for what it is. Europe and America are in the process of destroying this world. This is what Fanon has identified. And people in Europe we spoke to, their top philosophers, people like Sartre, who we went to go visit, acknowledge, yeah, Fanon, you're right. Europe is moving, and America is moving the world towards the abyss. They're going to destroy us, either militarily, or through new viruses, or through ecological disaster. But one way or other, we are going to be destroyed as a planet, as a species. We're on the way out. Unless Africa can say, we are not benefiting from this crappy system that you guys have created. We are not the beneficiaries. So because they're benefiting you, they are unable to fight against the monster that they've created. The only people who are able to create an alternative to that monster are the people who are being attacked by that monster. And that's Africa, that's Latin America. So we need to start beginning those conversations, but we need to stop accepting the propaganda that is being fed to us at face value. And we need to start thinking about these things differently. Right. Shall we take a break? When we come back, then we say, okay, let's move from the general to the specific, and let's say now, what has now happened in the college sector? What is the global story being sold to us in the college sector? And what are some of the ways in which we possibly can then begin to respond? I don't have answers, but I can put a general, phrase out there. Sorry, I'm just going to, sorry, before I go, let me comment, Sonny Boy, let me comment on your comment. So, no love lost between me and Zuma. But let me just point out a couple of things. When Zuma came on board, and Mbeki, by the way, was also a victim. Mbeki and Gaddafi tried to unite Africa. The next thing we knew, they're out. Those were not decisions that were made yet, but that's another point. When Zuma came on board, there were a couple of things that he did, and nobody talks about this. We were 18% of South Africans didn't go to school. When Zuma left, that number was down by 10%, which is a miracle anywhere in the world. Right? But we dropped the illiteracy rate down to 8%, from 18 to 8%. Right? We upped the number of students who completed matric from 60% who didn't have, from 70% who didn't have to 60%. So as Zuma said in his speech, we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. We still have a long way to go, but there were huge improvements. Poverty, because he started to introduce those social grants, poverty was drastically reduced. So was the AIDS crisis. Right? So there were huge social problems that we had pre-Zuma that post-Zuma was no longer a problem necessarily. Well, still a problem, but it took a huge chunk out of it. But there's a particular narrative that goes on that we don't necessarily start to think about. So like I say, even in Zuma, and don't get me wrong, there's no love lost between myself and President Zuma. But there are two sides to every story. And in order for you to know the truth, this is one of the European philosophers, but the Africans that said this, Fanon had said this way before them. In order to know the truth, you need to go to the other side of the truth and see how is that truth not the truth. So doubt, and I suppose this Zwandile is probably the point. Doubt everything that you know. Doubt it. You may come up to the same conclusion, but you need to arrive at that conclusion for yourself. Okay, thanks everyone. 10-minute break, half past, we come back.
Thank
I've
you.
actually got some of these. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Sonny
Thank
boy,
you.
Okay. Did you want to say something, Sonny boy? So,
No, sir.
comments, because I'm the only one who's ever said yes, but you know, there's a phrase in Julius Caesar that Shakespeare wrote. He says, the evil that men do live after them, but the good is often interred in their bones. And if you heard that, so Mark Antony says in his speech, you know, the evil that people do lives after them, but the good gets buried. So that's some of it, you know. We're not allowed to say good things about Zuma. We're not allowed to say that maybe what's his name? Putin has a point. So even if we disagree with him, doesn't mean that we can't see his point of view as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
While everyone is going on a break, can I just ask as well?
Yeah, I think we should all go on a break. Yeah, I'm listening to it.
Yeah. So what I came across something yesterday that it was a bit staggering for me. You know, when comparing India, South Africa, China, and Russia, obviously, I just want to go to India and Brazil as well. You know, their unemployment rate is, India is less than 10%, Brazil also less than 10%, and South Africa with over 30%. And it just doesn't make sense to me, because all of these people, especially India, has a population of over 1 billion people, and most of them are displaced. But how is it possible that we've got such a low unemployment rate than us?
You know, I can't explain that. Even in other African countries, our unemployment rate is through the roof, and we're supposed to be the richest African country.
Exactly.
I can't figure it out. I don't know what's going on. And that's one of those questions. There was a time, because people say economic growth is that supposed to be the solution. But there was a time under Mbeki where economic growth was just it was good, and it did what the power told him to do. But at the same time, as our economy was growing, the employment was going in the opposite direction. The more our economy grew, the more jobs we lost.
So the economy was growing at the expense of job losses, job shedding.
Exactly. Exactly. So we were being sold a lie. It was an untruth. But we believe it because it's in the interest of certain people for us to believe these lies. What is important is not whether it's a lie or whether it's a truth. What's important is who's behind it and who benefits and who loses.
So there's a whole lot of false reporting that happens around these media houses.
And through education. We're part of the indoctrination process. We're also supposed to indoctrinate you into believing certain stuff. That's our job.
Sure.
So if we told you certain other things, if we had to tell you, what are your rights as lecturers and what have you, why would the company send them? Why people send you to us? Because we're a problem. So we can't teach labor rights and that kind of stuff because the companies are funding the workers to come here. They'll just take their business somewhere else.
Of course.
Yeah, so there's a lot of thinking work to do.
Yeah.
And I've only recently, I'm going to show you now in the next slide, I've only recently changed my position somewhat. Where I'm trying to move towards a new space intellectually. But I need other people to help me think this thing through, you know.
I hear you.
And yeah, and I'm quite honest. You guys are my yes, you are students, but you're also my colleagues. So this is new stuff, and I'm hoping that you guys can do the things that we fail to do. So we can only tell you this is how far we got.
So we need to go against the system now.
Yeah. We need to read. We need to. There was an organization called, I was reading over the weekend, an organization called Society of Africa. What's his name? Abita Bata, and they had this idea: we fight ideas with ideas. There are certain ideas that are out there. We need to develop counter ideas, and we need to start forming think tanks around them. To start saying, is this true? How do we maneuver it? But I'm gonna have a look at my new proposed framework. I haven't published this yet.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna put out to you guys now my new proposed framework, the way that I'm starting to think about these things, about the new direction we should be taking. Okay, so nearly go have some coffee.
Thank you.
Walangani, how are you doing? Let me go see if I can grab a cup of coffee. Hi, everyone. Are we back?
Hey,
Azania,
Bo.
Yes, sir.
can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
You can hear me now? Okay, cool. All right. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I had a different slideshow prepared. But given our earlier... Rachel, I saw that you had problems with your sound. Are you okay now? Rachel, is your sound sorted out now?
Oh, Mr. Tim, it looks like she has a problem with her sound. She says she can't hear anything that you're saying on her side.
I saw that, yes. I saw that. Because I saw she came on briefly. And I heard her, but yeah. Anyway, we are recording. Yeah, we are recording. All right. So let me look at... I've shifted the order, just to let you know, I've shifted the order of those slides slightly. Because I want to start by just looking at some of the ideas that has happened with the whole Thatcherite revolution, which has happened in colleges. And these are ideas that are circulating through the world. The one idea, and let me actually start with the second idea first. Sorry, just give me a second. No, it's not going to work. Well, the first idea is the whole idea that colleges, in fact, everything, and this is not something that's affected the college sector alone. It's not affected education alone. These are ideas that spread across the sector as part of the Thatcherite revolution, where people are saying that this thought revolution, this ideological onslaught, is saying that the poor need to pay for everything. The state needs to pay for itself. Business can't support this. The state needs support for pay for itself. And what you have across the board is privatization. So there are many more hospitals offered on a private basis. If you go to a hospital nowadays and you earn a certain amount of money, you have to pay to go into the hospital. There are schools that you have to pay to go into. Social services, so you can get public social services, you also have paid social services, right? So there's lots of privatization, and partly what happens with the marketization, the privatization, is that you then get here's a nice fancy word for you, a bifurcated system, a divided system. So you have two races in the country now, rich and poor. And so you have a different kind of apartheid. You have an apartheid of money. So people don't look at the color of your skin. Yeah, they still do that as well. But they also look at the color of your money. So instead of, in my day, we had whites and non-whites, right? So if we went to go swim at the beach, there was like a fence separating, us dark people from our fairer skin counterparts. Right? There was a fence running in between us. We had to use different subways as we went down into the beach. So there were all those kind of things. But now it's not just that. Now it's the color of your money. So certain beaches then become more private than others. Even the beaches. Right? So you can pay to go into certain beaches. You have to pay to get into certain hospitals. You have to pay to get into certain schools. You have to pay to get into to get certain levels of social services, etc. So if you have cancer and you have money, you can get one kind of doctor. If you don't have cancer, you must go into the public system. And the public system doesn't always work as well as the private system. So in that way, the state says the state must pay for itself, but those people with money have found a way to protect themselves by setting up a private system for the rich only, right? Or for moneyed people only. And people like myself can now belong to that class of people, right? So I am now, I'm an honorary white. I can send my child to the good school. I can I can take my wife to the good hospital, you know. So what used to be a white-only hospital is I can now go to 2. Because I have the money to get in. Not always, but yeah, sometimes I have the money to get in. So there's a new system. And this privatization has now happened across the board. We've even privatized public stuff. So a public school can now charge fees. A public college can now charge fees. And that way we can keep the hoi polloi out, and this is only for us. And the public system doesn't operate as well as this other system. Is bifurcated. There's an apartheid between these stuff, but it's an apartheid of money. And so marketization does this. Education now becomes a commodity. It's something that we sell. So this is a marketization of education. But the marketization goes further because now the public education has to pay for itself to an extent. So it charges fees. It becomes all of your campuses are cost centers. They're not campuses. They don't offer education. They are a business. And so there's they say that we need to follow, and you'll hear this. It's an ideology. It's a mantra that we're being taught. We need to follow business principles. Now, business principles are not about helping people. Business principles is about making money. But we need to follow business principles. We need to become more sustainable. We need to become, there's all kinds of stuff. We need to match business needs. So we have to go wherever the money is. And so your CETAs provide opportunities for that, etc. And some of our colleges have been quite good at this. It's not like, and I think that many of you have said this, it's not like we get to choose the game. So you can't hate the colleges for playing the game. Some colleges play this game better than others, and they have their own money, which means they can do development work with the money they get. So they kind of take from the rich and they give to the poor. Right. So we can't wish this game away, and we'll discuss that next week when we discuss theories of development. Right. But the game is there, and this game is part of an international movement of policy borrowing, policy convergence, that kind of thing. These are policies that come from. So all over the world, things are being marketized because colleges and university and ESCOM has to pay for itself. The colleges have to pay for itself. The hospital system has to pay for itself as far as possible. We can't have all these poor leeches coming onto the system and leeching things off us. Right? The schools have to pay for themselves. So some way users to pay for them, others, but and there are advantages to do it and the disadvantages, but that is what is happening. Marketization, privatization is the order of the day, not just in colleges, all over. And that's the one thing, and some of you will notice it, how marketization happens. The other thing, and this is again a general trend across all this, is the growth of something that's called, some people call it managerialism. People like Stephen Ball, who writes in the education field. It's the rise of the new public administration, because they're saying that the colleges must pay for themselves, and so they must be better managed, and everything is about efficiency. And so other people have called it different words. People have called it the McDonaldization of society. Everything must be more efficient. You must hand in your numbers and say, so many people have been in my class, so many people have passed, so many people have failed. You're not being efficient. People are not coming efficiently through your classes. Right? What is your pass rate? Have you got an attendance register? Where's your quality assurance mechanisms? So all those things, and accountability, of course, is a good thing, depending on how accountability is practiced, because sometimes accountability can be the opposite of accountability. So we use phrases like carbon credits, in order to sell something that is not necessarily a good thing. Right? Nobody's against accountability. The word sounds nice. But is what we have actually accountability, or is it something else? And so people are in the literature, they give it this different names. My favorite is the McDonaldization, book written by George Ritzer. You know, where everything becomes a McDonald's, got to be more efficient. Your workers have got to be more flexible. And basically also McDonaldization partly means cheaper workers, etc. But you've got to really be an efficient cost center. There's other people call it an audit culture, where people are constantly checking on you. Other people like Foucault and Paul and them call it surveillance, where everybody is under the eye. You're being watched. You're being watched. Your students are being watched. Your marks are being watched. Your attendance register is being watched. Everything has got to be recorded so that somebody knows what you are doing. And you have constantly shown that you are doing the stuff. And so by surveillance is one way of exercising control over those amongst you. Are you sticking to the narrative? This is the narrative that's been given you. Are you sticking to the narrative? Let us surveil this narrative. Right. The other word, and we'll do this much later when we look at US lecturers, is performativity. So people don't have to perform, but they have to show that they are performing. So it's performativity. So some colleges will only recruit grade 12s because they know that that's going to push up their pass rate. It's not important. What is important is not that students understand things. What is important is that students pass. It's the performativity. It's the numbers. People have to play the game. So if you understand the game, then you can play it. And the other thing about managerialism, and this is what we mentioned it last week, is decentralization. And so that the battles, the struggles around education, the struggles around health, the struggles around welfare, the struggles around poverty, all those struggles are moved away from the center, and they localized, they individualized. They say, either this is your struggle as an individual person. This is not everybody's struggle. This is, you've got to do it. You've got to make sure that plastic gets recycled. It's not the company's problem. It's not the world problem. It's your problem. You can do it. You must make sure that you study, and you must learn hard and get ahead. Let's ignore all these other things that are going around you. The fact that you have to walk through gangsters, the fact that you're hungry, etc. That's not the problem. You must do it. So you responsibilize people, and you co-opt people, and then you bring people on board. So you bring people on board on things like the college council, and you say, but you've got a representative on college council, a representative, and then the representative's role changes. So instead of representing you, the way in which the new managerialism works is that this person has to represent the college council to you rather than you to the college council. They've reversed the role of what the representative does. They've co-opted the representative. And they say, but you have a representative. So there's all kinds of things happening, and this has been a movement, and it started with Thatcher of the new public administration, of the lean, mean government. Privatize, lean, mean government. And it's affected education. So these are ideas that you will see in your own college, and they play themselves out in different ways. The third set of ideas, and this has almost been partly by accident, but partly also because of an idea called human capital theory, which comes out of that Chicago schoolhouse, comes out of that house of ideas. Human capital theory has been accepted, and you'll see lots of the African stuff speak about human capital theory as if it's the next best thing since sliced bread, right? Since ice cream, I suppose, which was invented in China, by the way. And not in Italy. So human capital theory, says that if people go to school, then they're all going to become rich. That's the promise of TVET. Right? You go to school, you get a job. Anki Dori, we've provided for you. Right? We've individualized the problem. You can solve the problem, just go to college. And so college is not a place where you learn. And we know this is in 1979, I think Collins brought out his book on credentialism. College is not the place where you learn. College is about handing out certificates. Not knowledge, certificates. And the universities often knows about getting the certificate. So it's credentialism. Can I get a piece of paper? And so you have people running around doing this little paper chase. And in this, for lots of your students, it's a very strange paper chase, because when we were doing research in the colleges where here in the Western Cape, we came across students who were doing the NCV. So they do NCV 2, 3, 4. So that means they're at level 4. Then they go back and they go do the N2. Even though they've got NCV 4, they go do the N2. You know why? Because the N2 is going to get them into the learnership program. And then from the learnership program, they go do the trade test. Or the learnership program will give them access to a work. So they're using the NCV qualification, not because they want the piece of paper, because that qualification gives them access to other people, which opens up a door for them via the college sector. But they're zigzagging through the system. They're going up and down, up and down, up and down. They do an NCV4, then they go back to do an N2, and then they go back to do an NQF2 qualification or an NQF3 qualification for a learnership. And then they go do their trade test. So they study the same thing four times over. So very strange things are happening in terms of how we deal with credentials and how we deal with this whole question of the paper chase. And so people want to have a piece of paper, and I mean, you and I are probably in the same boat. I want to get this piece of paper. Whether I understand what Tim says is not important. So long as I get this piece of paper, that is what is important. The knowledge that comes with this piece of paper, no. Right. So we do this instrumental approach to education. And in many ways, the way in which we set the system up, because we've turned education into a commodity, something that we buy and sell, it sets it up so that it does this. So people are not interested in the learning, they're interested in that piece of paper at the end of the day. And so these things are happening across the board in countries all over the world. It's not just here. And so in your class, if you bring in new stuff, your students will ask you, Miss, is this in the test? Because the test is all that counts. And by using the test, you can control people as to what they learn and what they don't learn. You control knowledge. If you control the goalpost, you control how the game gets played. And those are the kind of things that are happening in the college. But here's the back, and we've known this since 1972. Ronald Doe wrote about this. Is that the other side of the story is that the more qualifications people get, it's like money. It's like a commodity. The more qualification, the more people who get qualification, the less that qualification means. So what you get is you get credential inflation. So suddenly jobs that needed a grade 10 suddenly need a grade 12. Not because they need a grade 12, but because they can. So that SACWA at one stage. So we were getting lots of calls where industries where people were asking, this is what I got. Is this equivalent to something else? Is this equivalent to a matric? So you had people who were doing the job for 15 years and they were suddenly underqualified to do it because there was diploma inflation. You were able to do your job previously. You could come in with an artisan qualification and we train you. Now you need to have an artisan qualification plus a TVET lecturer qualification before you're allowed to teach. So education becomes a business. Universities as well. We become a business. We're selling qualifications. That's our business. Not knowledge, qualifications. So it shifts the way in which education happens. So that's kind of what's happening on the education front. And there are different ways, and I'll look at that later, but let me just see if I can go back a bit and say that, let's not look at that. Because I promised one of you that I'll have a look at this. there are almost 4 broad ways that one can respond. Sorry, let me get a better view of this. Like we don't have much time. Sorry, folk. Come on. Why is this thing taking so long? There we go. So this is my own kind of concoction, but it is out there. I've just given it different names. Now, all of us want to be optimists, right? And this is one view. So these are the people who respond to globalization. And this is human capital theory. They speak about the knowledge economy. This is what the theory is actually called, human capital theory. And human capital theory, I'll send you the slide with the notes because we're running out of time. But human capital theory, basically it argues that if you study, you will become productive and you will get a job. That the new capital, the new form of money is human capital. And so they're asking companies to invest in knowledge. Send your people out, go get them to work, go get them to be knowledgeable, and then when they come back, they're going to be better workers and you will make money. And the slogan that they use is this notion that the only constant is change. So they're buying into a particular version of globalization. They're saying that change is going to happen all the time. We must catch up. We must keep up. And we're constantly running after the change. And so we must train our people. We must train our people. We must train our people. And so they will tell you, and each one of these will have this different stuff. They will tell you that the key issue for colleges, the key issue for education rather, this is the response of education. Education must respond to the problem that is skills mismatch. The economy is developing and the skills are lagging behind. Our people are not keeping up. Our people are not educated enough. There's little evidence of that, but that's what they're saying is the issue. And the purpose of education for them is that people must learn to work. And we call them optimists. Some people would call them naive optimists. They're saying that this is what globalization does. We must all keep up. Right? It's going to change all the time. There's a skills mismatch. People must learn to work. There are other people who are saying, you know what? And this is the skills formation theory, which has been a counter narrative. This, by the way, is the dominant theory. Everybody who operates in government, everybody who operates in lots of your African literature accepts this as Bible. They haven't even questioned it. They haven't even thought of options. But there have been other theories, and the main challenge to them has been the pessimists who say that if you look at the evidence, skills formation theory says that the more things have changed, the more they've remained the same. That the poor people who go study end up being poor people who grow up. Some of them escape, like they have all the years, some of them escape, but the vast majority of people end up where they have ended up. And you'll see that if you go to certain countries, they have what, and this is what South Africa has, is they have what they call a low skills regime. That the way in which people make profit is not by knowledge work. Profit continues to be driven by low wages in country after country after country, including the USA, including Britain, including the rich countries. So your Amazon workers, the way in which you make money of the Amazon workers is by pushing up production, paying them less. Don't get them unionized. So this whole notion of a high skills economy, etc., knowledge economy, they're saying that's nonsense. because it doesn't actually exist in real life. It's a myth. Countries operate along with low skills regimes. South Africa, the way in which our top companies make money is by low skills. And so they will actually, skills formation theory predicts, there will actually be some companies who will rather pay an unqualified electrician to come work for them than a qualified electrician, because a qualified electrician charges too much money. So they will train up their own people and pay them low wages, etc., because they get either a cheaper worker or a more obedient worker. One of the two. Ideally, both cheaper and more obedient. And you've got to be happy and thankful that you have this job, right? Which makes them rich. So things have changed, but they're not changing. It only looks like they're changing. And so what the pessimists, I shouldn't call them pessimists, the skills formation theory people are arguing, is they saying that if you want to benefit the learners, people shouldn't just work to learn, because the companies are not going to let them learn everything that they want. So if you're working for a tire company, they're not going to give you a whole qualification. They're only going to teach you tires because you must be beneficial to them, not to themselves. There are companies that we try to get to send people on learnerships, etc. They don't want to. They say, but why? Because then they're going to become qualified and they're going to leave us, or they're going to ask for more wages. My wife walked around, she knocked on people's doors, asking them, to take people in. They said, no. We need to pay people less, and that's kind of lots of South Africa's mentality, because of our history, is around cheap labor, in particular cheap black labor, and they believe that black people are prepared to work for cheaper wages. So get rid of all the white workers and replace them with cheaper black workers, if you can. And what the pessimists would argue is that if you want people to benefit, then we need to use the workplaces as opportunities so that people can learn stuff that goes beyond just their workplace. So they mustn't learn to fix tires. They must learn about the theory of pneumatics. They must learn science and that kind of stuff, so that their working becomes a stepping stone to an opportunity to get better certification, better learning, etc. Because they're saying that the companies are not going to do it. Companies supposed to be training, but if you look at companies, even education companies, they don't train their own people because it's not in their best interest to do so. So they're pessimistic about the ability of companies to train. Then you get, and this is probably a place that I've been at for a long time, you get the skeptics. And they're saying that skill is driven by a certain political economy. And their kind of slogan, you see each of these kind of have a slogan that I made up for them. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Their kind of slogan would be that things change in order to remain the same. The fact that they're remaining the same is not because, by accident, but in fact, the things were changed in the first place. So there were lots and lots of worker struggles, and the trade union was becoming very strong and what have you. So what do? We robotize our work. We replace disobedient workers with robots. And because all these workers were going on work education and that kind of stuff, and they were getting to know their rights, etc., says, no, we don't need that kind of training. We need to give our workers training so that they can become more obedient and so they can become more productive workers. This is not about developing them. This is about how can we make our workers more obedient and more productive? How can they be more compliant and more creative in their workplace? Not more critical, more compliant, more creative. And that is the purpose of training. And so we change and we provided more education because we need control. We changed and we provided more education and training because we need to control the narrative, and education is a brilliant form of indoctrination. And if we can pay the education institutions and make them dependent on our money, we can tell the education institutions what it is that they must teach. So we can control the narrative by controlling the purse strings of the education institutions. And what skeptics would then argue is that what we need, I'm going to finish off now, is that what we need is we need to use that training and those opportunities that they've given us to look, and we need to transform and use disruptive spaces within what has been created for us in order to create transformative workplace learning. But I think, as some of you have pointed out, we need to be careful when we do these things. So when you start doing transformative workplace learning and your workers come back transformed, those workers will probably get fired because they didn't do what they were supposed to do at education. So Amazon then sends people on education courses about, why belonging to a union is a bad idea. That's the kind of courses that they send you on. And so we make more creative and we provide skills, etc. But the skills and the narrative is changed. So we're not providing skills because the workers who are beginning to educate themselves. We need to make sure that we control the education system. That's just one way of kind of looking at how things change in order to remain the same. In order for people to get control, they needed to make certain concessions that they themselves could control. So things change in order to create the same. I am trying, and I was telling Zwandile this, I'm trying to move myself from here, because this is a point where you're just complaining and you're saying, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. I think that we need to move to a point in saying, globalization is happening, folks. It's happening. Human capital theory, all that stuff, it's happening. You can't wish it away. You can't moralize it away. So the question that we need to ask ourselves now, and we don't have much research on this kind of stuff. That's where we're turning to you, because you guys are on the ground. We need to say, okay, there are these constraints. There are problems. We can't just fight back, as some of you were saying in the posts. Right? There are constraints. What can we do under the current conditions? Again, I'm going to quote from the Bible. Jesus says, if you've got, I'm trying to remember the quote and where it comes from. It says, what ruler amongst you will go into battle with 10,000 soldiers against an army of 20,000 soldiers? If you have 10,000 soldiers, are you going to fight with 20,000? You need to evaluate whether you can. And if you can't, then rather go sue for peace. Go make terms with the other person. Right? There are times when smaller armies, I know that in the Second World War, Rommel beat the British with a much smaller army because of the way in which he mobilized his force. Mao Zedong did the same. They did the same in Vietnam. Right? With pop guns, they were beating the most highly equipped army in the world. So there are times when you can do it. But we need to work out what is it strategically and tactically that can be done, rather than saying, we're going to fight everything. Right? My dad used to speak about the revolution of the flea. He says the flea is not going to stand up to the hand and say, I'm going to take the hand on. The flea looks here, and when the hand comes, the flea jumps away. You must never be able to catch the flea. And lots of the social revolutions that happened were based on guerrilla warfare, about fighting in intelligent ways. But what knowledge does is knowledge enables us to predict what is going to happen. And we will know if we have good theory, if we can figure it out beforehand. And if you can fight ideas with ideas, we will know beforehand what is going to happen so that we can strategize and head them off at the pass. Because the thing is that the ruling forces are not as organized as they seem. The things, because they control the narrative, they become arrogant, they become complacent, and they become opulent. If we can strategize better than they do, if we can hone our own tools of analysis so that we know what's coming and develop alternative strategies, That will benefit us. But in order for us to do that, we first need to understand the situation, not what we think should be, but what actually is going to happen. So there's a difference between what ought to happen and what is happening. And we need to work with the world as it is rather than with the world as we imagine it should be. And so that we can move from what is the case to what ought to be the case. And here there are a number of people. There's a philosophical movement called realism. And at the time that I typed this, there was a movement called social realism. And there's a new thinking going. It's not new, the guy's dead already, in fact. But it's called critical realism, where they're starting to look at now, how do we at least philosophically deal with this? But nobody has turned critical realism into strategies like they did in the old days. All right. But my time is up. My time is up. What I'm saying is that there are different approaches to the knowledge economy or to globalization. You may find when you read your articles, you need to identify, are these people optimists, pessimists, skeptics, or pragmatics? Where does this fit in? And this will give you a framework within which to begin to critique current work. So lots of the work that I had done in my early years had kind of been skeptical work, etc. And I'm critiquing and say that's not good enough. Some of my work was just bad. It was just optimist stuff, right? And now I can look at it and I can critique it from a particular perspective. But you need to know which camp you are in, so that you can begin to critique the other stuff and saying this is where this particular mode of thought falls short. All right. So there was much more, but I think that's all that we have time for today. I think I've gone 5 minutes over time. Are there any last words, parting shots?
Hello, from
Julie.
Julie.
I'm listening.
Yes. I
Sorry,
just want to.
Hi, Julie.
I just want to pose a question here. But are we also not, as TVET colleges, adding also or enhancing what this rich society wants to achieve by having this thing of saying our learners have passed with a 40%. And these learners go to industry, meaning to say they don't know 60%. Who then now is put in place of that 60% which they don't know?
Part of the problem. Those are the kinds of issues. Sometimes, no, not sometimes. Let's make no mistake. We are part of the system.
Yeah. Yes.
We are part of the system.
Yes.
And sometimes you need to fight the machine. Sometimes you need to work with the machine in order to get whatever you want. There are all kinds of ways in which one can approach this. So with the 40%, there are dangers to that, but it also goes with the whole credentialism, because lots of your students will actually want that to happen because they say, now I got my piece of paper. So credentialism comes into effect. It's not about whether people know stuff or don't know stuff. It's about, can I get my piece of paper? But in the long run, because it's mainly, the colleges are 92, 95% black. So that's kind of, and colleges are often, Volker Wiedekant in one of his other articles argues that colleges are being used to warehouse people. It's almost like a daycare center. To keep people in for the meantime, so they stop getting on naughty things in the street. So that's a more skeptical view of stuff. But anyway, he says it shouldn't be that way, but that's kind of what is happening as opposed to what should be happening. So we need to move things to where it should be happening. Now, one of the problems with the 40% thing is that colleges already have low status. This is all over the world. So the narrative that's being sold is these are institutions of first choice, we need to create parity of esteem, and everybody's promoting this, and we agree. We agree that that's what should be. The reality
Is that not also brainwashing?
Yeah. So we're telling people that this is happening. We say that is not actually what is happening. Colleges don't have parity of esteem. But now if you put people into the workplaces and they're not up to scratch, then your low status will be even lower. So you may actually have a valid point. There are lots of people who are going to argue against you because they're going to say that, look, but we need to push the pass rate up because that's the game.
Yeah,
if we push the pass rate down, that's going to be a problem. So this, I'm actually involved in that debate myself right now, because, for example, the school students, now lots of students then are going to opt to go to the school because there the pass rate is 40%. You guys have a 50% pass rate. In fact, in some school subjects, the 40% you can get in university, which you can't do with a college qualification. So they will go to the school route, not because it's better, but because it's easier. So the game has been created not by you, but for you, and students are playing the game. They're playing this credentialist game with you. And so they're going to object. Some of the policymakers may object. You guys will say, but I don't want to put these people because my problem is I have to put my stamp of approval and I have to say, where did people do this? This is law will teach you. What are they teaching in that college? So the college's reputation becomes even worse than it is. So I understand where you're coming from. Yeah. So anyway, I do understand. And the question is now, how do we improve it? The other question that I would want to ask, and I think Nigel is going to ask this in the module that you do in your second year, is what does 40% even mean? When people say 40, what does 40% mean? Why is the pass mark 40%? Why is it 60%? Why is it not 100%? So even our understanding of and globalization has done there's been some good things coming out of globalization as well. I'll probably touch on that next week. So I'll look at this is the good, this is the bad of what is being proposed. But there's some changes within assessment that we may need to think about, is that the whole notion of a 40% is an antiquated notion that comes out of the schools. It comes out of a particular understanding of how knowledge works. It comes out of measurement, etc. It's not necessarily a good way of measuring things. 40% of what? What does 40% mean? And should we be looking at alternative ways of assessing students rather than saying 40%, 30%? 60%. In fact, the notion of 40% comes from IQ tests. And the guy who invented IQ tests, who actually reinvented IQ tests, it's a guy by the name of Tremaine. Before that, it's a guy Bene, but anyway, it's a more complicated story. But when Tremaine, the IQ test that we're using today is based on a guy by Tremaine. Now, Tremaine believed that people were either born clever or born stupid. Rather than IQ, something that can go up and down. And he believed in something that was called, it's my son, he knows the word. Jordan? What are those people who believe in race? I can't remember what they called anyway, but the phrase slips me now. But they believe that some races are superior to others. Those people who believe in race and the theory, man. Eugenics, thank you. Eugenics believes that certain people have better eugenics than others. That working class people are stupid and middle class people are better. That's why working class people are working class people. Yeah. Yeah, so it was originally classism and then later on became racism. Right. So those are some of the things that people believed in historically, and Tremaine was a big person. And that idea of eugenics, which is the idea, by the way, which drove the Nazism, the Nazis in Europe, because they believed that Aryans, if you had blonde and white hair, you're automatically superior, and so they tried to breed out inferior genes. Now, this is what Tremaine believed. And this belief has found its way into the education system, and it's now become the foundation of the education system, and so that we can then measure intelligence. And that's what your test is trying to do. That's why everybody gets put on a curve. So what the test is supposed to do is the test is supposed to separate the stupid people from the clever people. That's what it's trying to say. It's not how much you know, it's are you stupid or are you clever? It's based on that. That's the idea on which it is based. So even the idea of a 40% has got very weak foundations, but it's one of those ideas that remains like a dinosaur in our system. It's a zombie category. It's a zombie that's in our system that walks around. Yeah, so that's an entirely a different debate. That's a discussion you'll probably have with Nigel about what does 40% mean, and are there other alternative means of assessment that we should be looking at? Not even 100% or yeah. It's a debate. It's a debate, Tuli. It's a debate. Guys, anybody, whoever wants to go can go. I'm done unless there are.
Yeah, I think we have a lot to talk about, Mr. Tim.
But I'm also I'm also very happy to kind of sit around and just talk about stuff.
Yeah.
So my wife will probably call me while those ones say, what you up to?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But assessment is a big issue. The way in which we run our education system, some of it is just antiquated. And here's where I think the globalization people have done some work, and where we are actually able, we are able to infiltrate globalization. I suspect that's what we need to do right now, because this is not the 80s anymore. In the 80s, everybody was organized. People were strong. There was a strong movement, etc. That's gone. There is no strong movement anymore. Right? All the people who were strong in the movement have gone to the other side. They're now working for the other side. So unless we rebuild the movement, we may need to think about how do we infiltrate the existing structures and make them do what we want to do. But we have to be a little bit more tactical about how we do things now than we were in, for example, the 1980s. We have to develop new strategies, new tactics. Some of the old tactics may still work, but we may need to develop a whole new set of that stuff. That's an area my wife won't like me telling you this, but it's an area where my wife is extremely good. She's been remarkably creative. Okay, folks. Anything else? I'm recording this. I shouldn't be recording this stuff. All right, I'm going to stop presenting. Okay. Anybody else have any other comments to add? Let me stop recording as well. How does this thing work?